Hello. I guess I'm gonna start the stream, start going through material, and then people can show up as they come. We'll fill them in. Oh, wait, it's next either. Oh, how do I? So, if you don't already, please make sure you follow Fiveable at Think Fiveable on all our social media platforms, like our Twitter, our Instagram, our YouTube. We post a lot of Instagram stories. Their Instagram is really great. I totally recommend, if you have Instagram, to follow Fiveable on Instagram. Here's some of the future streams we have planned. On November 4th, we have a stream that's going to have a special focus on causation in period 4. And then the next day, November 5th, we're going to have a recap of all of the events in period 4. So say you have a test coming up on period 4 topics, you could use that stream as a refresher, or if you're just trying to review on your own or get ahead, it'll serve as a great introduction to period 4 in the event. And then on November 7th, we're going to have a stream that is it's going to be an introduction to period 4. Well, not introduction, a writing in period 4. So, like, you might go over an example of a short essay question, an example of a DBQ, what potential short answer and DBQ topics, maybe an example of the different LEQ types, so you know what you will be expected to write. So here's the agenda today. So we're going to talk about some non-abolitionist reforms first. So that might be like about asylums, cultural reform, women's reform. Then we're going to talk about, well, what is abolitionism? And then we're going to talk about William Lloyd Garrison. He's a really famous abolitionist. You got to know him. We're going to talk about the American Anti-Slavery Society, which he helps to found, the Liberator, a newspaper William Lloyd Garrison founded, other abolitionists. There's so many others we're going to talk about. You'll be really great at abolitionists because they are so important, because they really do cause a lot of the sectional tensions before the Civil War. They really are kind of to blame. Then we're going to talk about the Underground Railroad, which is very important. So we're going to talk about Harriet Tubman, Underground Railroad. We're going to talk about the American Colonization Society. Oh, I forgot to put this on the slide, but also a few rebellions. Those are fun. Who doesn't like a rebellion? A good old rebellion. Okay. So let's start talking about an age of reform, like criminal reform. So criminal codes in states are being kind of reduced, like they're being softened. So like if you think about what's happening now around in the states around the issue of marijuana and medical marijuana, it's kind of like that, like it's kind of being lessened. And the number of capital offenses during this time period was also being lowered, because society has begun to believe, the American society has begun to believe that prison should not only punish, or should not just punish Their sole purpose isn't to punish. Their sole purpose is to reform the prisoners so they don't go to prison again. And so, to lower crime rate. Dorothy Dix, she's like a medical doctor. She visits asylums throughout the country and writes an essay. She writes a report on her findings and protest about them because people that were in asylums weren't treated all that great. So she really wants to help them. So she protests. Her protest result in improved conditions for the mentally ill. In 1828, the American Peace Society was founded. Are there any questions so far? Great. So let's talk about temperance. So in the early 1800s, many Americans developed drinking problems due to social norms and having a really difficult, tedious life. In 1826, the American Temperance Movement, something. I forgot. I'm missing a word in my slides, and I don't remember the whole detail. Persuade people to stop drinking because drinking decreases worker productivity and also threatens family structure. So then one example of a really early prohibition thing, we'll get to prohibition later, 18th Amendment, as you can see on the slides, 1918. So Neil S. Dow thought alcohol should be illegal. He is also known as the father of prohibition. He supports the Maine law in Maine in 1851 that bans the selling of alcohol. Okay, so let's talk about women's rights. So in the early 1800s, the role of women in society is to stay at home and be subordinate to their husband. They can't vote, and I don't want to say obviously, but because the 19th Amendment, I believe it was 19th Amendment, wasn't passed yet. And when women marry, they cannot retain their property. So you see, due to the property thing, women begin to stop marrying. And gender differences were really emphasized in the 1800s or the 19th century due to the market economy splitting men and women into different economic roles. So then, really important thing, you really got to know this. You should definitely do more research into it. You will definitely cover the Seneca Falls Convention in class. It is very important. And one of the things they do is they kind of rewrite the Declaration of Independence to include females. So you might see something, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. Because, in the Declaration of Independence, it's we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So women, and according to the Declaration of Independence, women are not equal to men. So, obviously women not happy, all that jazz, all that stuff. Okay, so what is abolitionism? Now we can actually get into the bulk of the stream. Now that we've covered these other reform movements, not saying anything bad about them, they're very important, The abolitionism is very important. That's why it gets its own name in the stream. So it's a movement in opposition to slavery. They are against slavery. Usually morally, there's a whole like anti-slavery thing where some of them are against slavery because it hurts white workers, like particularly the Irish. The Irish are kind of pro-slavery. Wait, no, I'm sorry, I was confusing myself. So abolitionism is a movement in opposition to slavery, calls for the immediate, uncompensated emancipation of all slaves. It's generally, before the Civil War, considered very radical. There's very few of them. But they still have they still found a way to increase sectional tension, kind of cause the Civil War. Not saying anything bad about them. I am truly grateful for their work. They were great people. They did a lot of great things. They advocate for legal rights for blacks, but not social equality. I forgot the not there. The not is key. But not social equality. Abolitionists are extremely vocal. They made slavery a national issue. Before, it was like once or twice a national issue. Missouri Compromise. That's really it. No one wanted to deal with slavery, especially the founders. That's why it's not really mentioned in the Constitution. And as tensions mount, they become more influential. So the more work they did, the more tensions mounted. The more tensions mounted, the more influential they became. So, it just kind of creates a loophole, or not a loophole, a time loop. Yeah. For those wondering, I also did not go trick-or-treating tonight. I was busy doing homework and going over my stream. Okay, so let's talk about William Lloyd Garrison. He's an abolitionist who founded the Liberator. It's an abolitionist newspaper in Boston in the year of 1831. He calls for immediate, you'll see this a lot, you've seen this before, immediate, uncompensated emancipation, as well as, this is the rare thing that makes him kind of a bit more extremist, civil equality for blacks. He also wants the North to secede from the Union, kind of crazy. He also creates the American Anti-Slavery Society. Speaking of the American Anti-Slavery Society, let's get into them. It's an organization created in opposition to slavery and is founded in 1833. They split up in 1840. The main issues being the role of women in the abolitionist movement, and the role of abolitionists as a political party. Like, should abolitionists seek political office? I don't think they would win. So they split into two groups. They kind of split on the issue, kind of like the Whigs. And they formed two groups. They formed, guess who? The American Anti-Slavery Society. And they also form the Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. The division doesn't really hurt the abolitionist movement that much, which is kind of a good thing if you think about it, because we kind of needed the abolitionists to exist for slavery to end, because they kind of create a lot of the sectional tension that caused the Civil War. So just for people that just can't tuned in have just joined, so we kind of talked about what abolitionism is, which you kind of know. I'll go back to it and explain it again because it's very important. So it's a movement in opposition to slavery. They're against slavery, and they call for the immediate, uncompensated emancipation of all slaves. And it's generally considered radical before the Civil War. So that's kind of all you have to know to get into more of it. Also that they create sectional tension. So let's talk about the Liberator. I mentioned it earlier, created by William Lloyd Garrison, and also Isaac Knapp, begins in 1831. The publication, bitter attacks on slavery. Their attacks on slavery, slave owners, as well as articles and speeches they have, using arguments based on morality. They are saying slavery is immoral, and to advocate their views of immediate emancipation. This makes it one of the most persuasive periodicals in the United States during this time period. Theodore Weld. Let's talk about what's going to Theodore Weld. He's an interesting fellow. He's an abolitionist student at the Wayne Theological Seminar. Oh no, I lost my thing. He is dismissed in 1834 from the school when trustees of the seminary attempt to suppress, or for those who don't know what suppress means, they kind of try and put an end to abolitionism on campus. That's because at some point, Theodore Weld led an anti-slavery demonstration on campus, and that led to a mass withdrawal of students from the school. So obviously, the Board of Trustees wouldn't like it if one demonstration caused a mass amount of people to leave. They would obviously want to dismiss the student because they don't want to support the cause. Because they want money. Okay, let's talk about the Grimke sisters. They're abolitionists, also feminists, so they kind of fit into feminism reform. So we have Angelina and Sarah Grimke. They're sisters who toured New England lecturing against slavery. So they're lecturing abolition. They become controversial, or they are controversial, because they lecture to both men and women. That's crazy. So you're thinking in 2018, that's not that crazy. But back then, women were supposed to have an education. I'm not saying anything bad against women, obviously, but that was kind of the view of the time. In 1838, but they both write classics of American feminism. Sarah wrote Letters on the Condition of Women and the Equality of the Sexes. Angelina, proud to capitalize, wrote Letters to Catherine E. Beecher. I'm going to pause for a second. Are there any questions about anything? Any questions? We're good? Let's move on to Elijah Lovejoy. He is an American abolitionist and editor of the anti-slavery periodical The Observer. Violent opposition from slaveholders in Missouri. His old headquarters is in Missouri. kind of forced him out violently. So he moves to Illinois, where he establishes the Alton Observer. And he was killed by a mob in 1837, and his death stimulated or kind of grew the abolitionist movement. Okay, well, let's talk about Wendell Phillips. He kind of becomes famous. The reason why I put him after Elijah Lovejoy is because he kind of becomes famous and well known because of his speech in protest of Elijah Lovejoy's death. So he's an American orator, abolitionist, and reformer. He spoke publicly in favor of women's rights, temperance, abolition, and the elimination of capital punishment. We kind of talked about all those, except for the elimination of capital punishment. We still have that today. Capital punishment in some states. And we already saw his most famous speech is called The Murder of Lovejoy, which protests Elijah Lovejoy's death, and this makes him kind of famous. Let's talk about Gabriel Prosser and his failed slave uprising. Who doesn't love a good uprising? So in 1800, he plans a slave uprising with the goal of creating a free black state. They intended to seize the federal arsenal of weapons in Richmond, Virginia. And he's portrayed by other slaves. They probably told their owners, or told the authorities, probably their owners. They told someone, doesn't really matter who. And Foster and his comrades were captured by the state militia and were executed. You kind of see this as a common theme, that slaves betray other slaves that are in rebellion. You might think, oh, why? That doesn't make sense. But then when you think about it, it does, because after every slave rebellion, the treatment of slaves gets worse. So most slaves don't want a slave rebellion. Makes sense. Okay, let's talk about Denmark Vesey. It's another example of a slave rebellion. He was a slave from South Carolina who bought his freedom with $1,500 he won in a lottery. Who knows how he entered the lottery? That's what I want to know. So in 1822, he planned to lead a group of slaves in attacking Charleston and stealing the city's weapons or arms. And once again, he's betrayed by other slaves, which results in the hanging of Vesey and his followers. Let's talk about Nat Turner. Nat Turner's rebellion, very interesting. Nat Turner is a slave who became convinced that he was chosen by God to lead his people, the slaves, to freedom. In Virginia, in 1831, in Virginia, Turner led around 70 blacks to a revolt against their masters. They kill before it's halted or stopped by the guard, the state militiamen. 55 whites were killed by Turner and his followers, and white mobs lynched other blacks. So you see, that's kind of an example of why they don't support slave rebellions, typically slaves. And the rebellion convinced white Southerners that slave rebellions were a constant threat to the institution of slavery. Rebellions are a constant threat. David Walker. Let's talk about David Walker and his appeal. Okay, so I'm gonna, because we just had someone join, I'm gonna go back and explain abolitionism because I think it's very important. And we're gonna talk about slave rebellion again. So abolitionists, they're opposed to slavery. They're calling for the immediate uncompensated emancipation of all slaves. And before the Civil War, they're considered a radical group of people. There's very few of them, but they have so much influence and they increase sectional tension so much. Okay, so let's talk about slave rebellion. So first we have Gabriel Prosser and his failed uprising. So he wants to create a free black state, basically. So he plans a rebellion. And they intend to seize federal weapons. Okay, I'll finish explaining this again. Actually, no, there's no need. But I'll do it anyway, because repetition is good. They intend to seize the federal arsenal in Richmond. He's portrayed by other slaves. We already discussed why slaves don't like rebellion. And he was executed. And we got Denmark Vesey, basically wins the lottery, gets money, pays for his freedom, supports a rebellion, betrayed by other slaves in his home. Nat Turner, kind of crazy. I don't want to say crazy, but became convinced he was chosen by God to lead his people to freedom. He leads a rebellion of around 70 blacks to revolt against their masters. Before the uprising, was halted by the white militiamen. 55 people were killed. And white mobs lynched many blacks. Turner and 15 of his followers were hung as a result of this. And the rebellion convinced Southerners that slave rebellions were a constant threat. Okay, let's talk about David Walker. He's a free black from Boston, published his appeal in 1829, advocating for a black rebellion to crush slavery. It's kind of that he wrote this. Many blacks can't read or write. Many slaves can't. Usually free slaves can, maybe. But normally slaves can't because they don't want them to learn to read or write for obvious reasons. And the purpose is to remind people that the real purpose is to remind slaves that slaves are American people and should be treated fairly. Okay, let's talk about Frederick Douglass. He's very famous. You should know something about Frederick Douglass. You probably know his book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. So he's an escaped slave who becomes a very powerful abolitionist public speaker. He captures his audiences with descriptions of his life as a slave. He also writes a book on the topic, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. You probably might read it in English, probably discuss it. He published a newspaper called the North Star in the early 1830s. His speeches encouraged slaves to escape like he did, and also motivated Northerners to oppose slavery. That's Sojourner Truth. She's a runaway slave who became an influential figure in both women's societies and the Abolitionist movement. Despite her illiteracy, she traveled widely through New England and the Midwest, giving speeches against sexual discrimination based on sex, like male or female, and godlessness and slavery. She is against slavery. She's an abolitionist. These speeches attract Large audience. Oh, I forgot to point out also, she's illiterate. She can't read or write, yet she's a really great at giving speeches. She writes really eloquent speeches. Then we have Harriet Tubman. You all should know Harriet Tubman. You probably know about her before APUSH, but you gotta learn about Harriet Tubman for APUSH. She's very important. She's a black woman. No duh. No offense, but kind of obvious. After she escaped from slavery in 1849, she decides to make 19 journeys back to the South to help more slaves escape to the North. She helped bring as many as 300 slaves to freedom. That's a lot of people. She's kind of the most famous leader of the Underground Railroad to black people. During the time she was known as Moses. So for those of you that are not Catholic, you probably don't, or no, not Catholic, Christian, probably don't recognize, you might not recognize Moses. So he liberates the Jews from Egypt under slavery. So you see, it's kind of the same thing. So let's talk about the Underground Railroad, because we just mentioned it. It was a secret network of anti-slavery Northerners. Am I missing a slide? Oh, I am missing a slide. It's fine. Anti-slavery Northerners who illegally, it's not legal, helped fugitive slaves escape to either free states, kind of risky, or Canada, where they're completely free because it's owned by the British. Hooray! In the period right before the Civil War. The system had no formal organization, yet it still helped thousands of slaves escape. That's actually kind of cool. That a system that wasn't organized helped so many people. Sure, it's not a lot, but helping thousands of people and not having any organized form is really helpful and is really cool. So let's talk about the American Colonization Society. This is the last little bit. So they support the sending of slaves back to Africa as freed people. It's a good idea in theory, but in reality, being in the United States, being under the influence of white Southerners and Northerners, and basically America and Europe, the West kind of changed the African American slaves culturally, so they're culturally different now than Africans. So it wouldn't really make sense for them to go back to Africa. That's kind of all I got. Are there any final questions? Okay, seeing no questions, I'm going to end the stream. I hope you all have a great night.